My name is Kylie. I'm 31 years old, and according to my mother, I am the ultimate financial burden. She spent all of Christmas dinner bragging about my brother's success while planning to kick me out of the family home, completely unaware that I'm the one who actually owns the deed. The smell of roasting turkey and rosemary usually brings people comfort, but in the Hartwell household, it felt more like the scent of an impending trial. I sat at the long mahogany table, my back straight against the rigid Victorian chair. I could feel a loose strand of my blonde hair tickling my neck, but I didn't move to tuck it away. In this house, any movement was an opening for a critique. 847, I whispered under my breath. "What was that, Kylie?" my mother, Evelyn, asked. She didn't look up from the gravy boat she was polishing with a linen cloth. Every piece of silver on this table had to gleam as if it were for sale. "Nothing, Mom, just thinking." The number was the count of the small gold fleur-de-lis on the hunter green wallpaper. I had counted them during every lecture, every birthday, and every holiday since I was 7. They were the only things in this house that stayed consistent. My brother, Daniel, swept into the room, smelling of expensive cologne and the cold December air. He adjusted his silk tie, his chest puffed out just enough to flash the partner pin on his lapel. "Sorry I'm late," though he didn't sound sorry at all. He slid into the seat directly across from me. "The firm is swamped. Client calls don't stop just because it's Christmas." "Oh, Daniel," Mom gushed, finally setting down the silver. She rushed over to press a kiss to his cheek. "You work too hard, but that's the price of being a leader, isn't it? We're so incredibly proud of you. A partner before 40. It's the Hartwell legacy personified." She turned her gaze toward me, and the warmth vanished, replaced with a thin, tight-lipped smile. I was wearing a cream-colored cashmere sweater, simple, high quality, but to her it looked like I'd given up. "It's a shame everyone doesn't share your drive," she said, her voice dropping an octave. Dad walked in then, carrying the turkey on a heavy platter. He looked tired, his shoulders stooping under the weight of more than just the bird. He offered me a small, sad smile, but he didn't say a word. He never did. As the plates were filled and the steam rose from the mashed potatoes, the air grew heavy. I picked at my food, listening to Daniel recount his latest big win in court. He spoke in jargon designed to make him sound indispensable, but I noticed the way his fingers trembled slightly when he reached for his wine glass. He was on his 3rd glass, and we hadn't even cleared the salad. Then it happened. The moment the tension finally snapped. Mom cleared her throat, setting her fork down with a sharp clink against the china. "Kylie," she began, her tone formal, "we've been talking, your father, Daniel, and I." I felt a cold prickle at the base of my spine. "About what?" "About the future," she said. She reached across the table to pat Daniel's hand. "Daniel has been so generous with his advice. He's helping us realize that we can't keep living in the past. We're getting older, and this house is a lot of work. More importantly, it's a lot of money." She paused, looking at me with a mixture of pity and resentment. "We have to make some hard choices, Kylie. We've poured so much into you over the years. Art school, that little consulting hobby of yours that never went anywhere. But a family is like a business. You invest where you see a return. And frankly, dear, you've become a financial burden." The words hung in the air, sharper than the carving knife Dad was still holding. "A burden?" I repeated, the word tasting like ash. "We're selling the house, Kylie," Daniel chimed in, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. "I've arranged a private buyout through my investment group. Mom and Dad will get a nice payout for retirement, and I'll handle the property, which means you'll need to find your own place by January 1st. I looked at the hunter green wallpaper, 847 fleur-de-lis. I wondered if the new owners would tear them down. "You're evicting me?" I asked quietly. "At Christmas dinner?" "We're liberating you," Mom corrected, her eyes cold. It's time you learned to stand on your own feet instead of leaning on a family that can no longer afford to carry your weight. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my water, feeling the weight of the secret I'd been carrying for 3 years. The silence in the room was suffocating, broken only by the sound of Daniel pouring his 4th glass of wine.
I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just sat there, feeling the weight of the silence, watching a bead of condensation drip down my water glass. January 1st, I said, my voice steadier than I expected. That's only a week away, Mom. It's snowing. The rental market is tight. Well, perhaps if you had a tight career instead of whatever it is you do on that laptop all day, you wouldn't be so worried, Daniel remarked, leaning back in his chair. He looked me up and down, his eyes lingering on my simple blonde ponytail. Look, Kylie, I'm doing this for your own good. I'm buying the house to keep it in the family name, technically, while giving Mom and Dad the liquidity they need. You've had a free ride for 30 years. It's time to grow up. A free ride? I looked around the room. I looked at the crown molding I had paid to have repaired 2 summers ago when the handyman Mom hired turned out to be a scammer. I looked at the floorboards that didn't creak anymore because I'd sent a contractor over while they were on vacation. Kylie, don't make that face, Mom said, waving a hand dismissively. We've been more than patient, but Daniel is a partner. He understands assets. He understands that this house is a sinking ship under our current arrangement. He's already set up the Hartwell Legacy Trust to manage the property. The Hartwell Legacy Trust, I repeated. I felt a cold, sharp smile tugging at the corners of my mouth, but I kept it hidden. And who is the primary stakeholder in this trust, Daniel? Is it you, or the people you owe money to? Daniel's face went from smug to a blotchy, panicked red in less than a second. He slammed his wineglass onto the table, the red liquid splashing onto the white lace cloth like a fresh wound. What is that supposed to mean? You've always been jealous, Kylie, ever since I got into law school and you were finding yourself in those little business seminars. Just because you can't balance a checkbook doesn't mean you can attack my character. Enough, Mom snapped, looking at me with genuine disappointment. Kylie, your brother is trying to save us. You are simply taking from us. The decision is made. The bank is calling tonight to finalize the transfer of the deed to the trust. We're putting it on speaker so your father and I can hear the confirmation. We wanted you to hear it too, so you'd understand that there's no going back. Actually, Dad spoke up, his voice barely a whisper. The bank representative said they needed to discuss a discrepancy in the title. Daniel scoffed. Probably just a clerical error. Hartwell National is old school. They probably haven't updated their digital filing for the 2024 tax year. Don't worry, Dad. I've got it under control. Just then, the phone on the sideboard began to ring. The shrill sound cut through the tension like a siren. Evelyn stood up, her silk dress rustling. She looked at me with a triumphant glint in her eyes. This is it, the end of the burden era. She picked up the phone and pressed the speaker button. Hello, this is Evelyn Hartwell, she said, her voice shifting back into her socialite persona, breathy, elegant, and entirely fake. Mrs. Hartwell, this is Mr. Henderson, Senior VP of Private Wealth at Hartwell National. I'm calling regarding the Hartwell estate on 42 Laurel Lane. We have a bit of a situation with the buyout request submitted by a Mr. Daniel Hartwell. Daniel straightened his tie, smirking at me. Yes, Mr. Henderson, this is Daniel. I'm here with the family. You can proceed with the deed transfer to the Legacy Trust. There was a long pause on the other end. I could hear the faint sound of papers shuffling. I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding, Mr. Hartwell, Henderson said, his tone turning noticeably colder. We cannot transfer the deed to your trust. In fact, we've been instructed to flag this attempt as potentially fraudulent. Evelyn's hand flew to her throat. Fraudulent? What on earth do you mean? This is our home. Madam, the banker replied, the property at 42 Laurel Lane was sold in a private off-market trust auction 6 months ago. The title is no longer in your name, nor is there a mortgage to be bought out.
The house is owned in its entirety by K-Star Holdings. The room went so quiet I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. Daniel's face didn't just turn white, it turned gray. K-Star? Mom whispered, looking confused. Who is K-Star? I leaned back, tucking a strand of blonde hair behind my ear, and looked directly at my brother. Yes, Daniel, tell them, who is K-Star? Daniel's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. He gripped the edge of the mahogany table so hard his knuckles turned a ghostly white. I don't know, he stammered, his voice cracking. It's probably a shell company, a predatory buyer. Mom, I told you the market was aggressive. Someone must have intercepted the foreclosure notice. Foreclosure? Mom's voice rose to a shrill peak. She turned her panicked gaze from the phone to Daniel. You said we were selling the house for retirement, Daniel. You said we had plenty of equity. Mr. Henderson, I said, raising my voice just enough to be heard over the rising panic. This is Kylie Hartwell. Could you please clarify the status of the K-Star Holdings acquisition for my family? On the other end of the line, Henderson's tone shifted instantly. It went from professional frostiness to warm, subservient recognition. Of course, Miss Hartwell. My apologies. I didn't realize you were on the line. To clarify for the others, K-Star Holdings purchased the debt on the property 3 years ago when the initial default notices were issued. 6 months ago, the trust exercised its right to a private buyout to prevent the property from hitting the public auction block. Mom looked like she'd been struck. Default notices? 3 years ago? She turned to Dad, who finally looked up, his eyes weary and hollow. I tried to tell you, Evelyn. The medical bills from my surgery, the dip in the pension. I thought Daniel was handling it. He said his firm had a plan. His plan was to let the house go into foreclosure so he could buy it back with a high-interest loan he couldn't afford using your remaining savings as a down payment. He was going to save the family by stealing the last of your retirement and putting the deed in his name. Daniel surged out of his chair. You're lying. You're a failed consultant who lives in a guest room. How could you possibly know anything about K-Star? I didn't answer him. Instead, I reached into the leather portfolio I'd kept hidden under my chair. I pulled out a single, thick document, the deed of sale, embossed with the state seal, and slid it across the table. It came to a stop right in front of the golden turkey. Mom reached for it with trembling fingers. She scanned the lines, her eyes darting back and forth until they landed on the signature line at the bottom. Kylie Hartwell, Managing Director, K-Star Holdings. She looked up at me, her face a mask of confusion. The financial burden sat before her, blonde hair perfectly composed, while her golden boy was sweating through his $500 shirt. You own the house? Mom asked, her voice small. I own the house, the land, and the debt Daniel tried to bury you in. I didn't do it to be a hero. I did it because I knew if I let Daniel handle it, you'd be on the street by Easter. I've been paying the property taxes, the insurance, and the maintenance for 3 years. Every time the roof was patched or the heater was fixed, that was K-Star. That was me. The silence that followed was different this time. It wasn't the silence of judgment. It was the silence of a total power collapse. The hunter green wallpaper seemed to press in on them. So, I said, standing up and smoothing out my cream sweater, about that January 1st deadline, I think we need to discuss who is actually moving out. Daniel's chair screeched against the hardwood floor as he lunged across the table, his hand clawing for the deed. I was faster. I pulled the folder back, tucking it under my arm as I stood. Give me that, he barked, his face a distorted mask of rage. You probably forged it. You've always been a liar, Kylie. A little blonde girl playing house with documents she doesn't understand. Where would you get that kind of money? You've been living in our guest room. I lived in the guest room because I wanted to keep an eye on Dad, I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. And I got the money because while you were busy trying to look like a partner, I was actually working. Those business seminars you mocked, they were investment conferences. That consulting hobby, it was a real estate portfolio that out-earned your salary 3 years ago. I looked at my mother. She was staring at the wine stain on the tablecloth, her mouth trembling. The Hartwell legacy she had spent 40 years building was literally being held together by the child she had just called a burden. "Evelyn," Dad said, his voice regaining a bit of strength, "do you hear what Henderson said? Daniel was going to let the bank take it." "I was going to fix it," Daniel screamed, spinning toward Dad. "I just needed a little more time, one more trade, one more deal." "With what, Daniel?" I interrupted. "With the investment group that doesn't exist? I did my due diligence before I bought the debt. I know about the casino markers in Atlantic City. I know about the loans you took from your firm's escrow account that you're frantically trying to replace before the annual audit." The color drained from Daniel's face so fast I thought he might faint. He sank back into his chair, the partner pin on his lapel looking like a cheap piece of tin. The room grew cold. The fire in the hearth had burned down to embers, and the scent of the rosemary turkey now felt cloying and oily. I walked over to the sideboard and picked up the bottle of vintage wine Daniel had brought. I looked at the label, a $300 Cabernet. "You bought this with Mom's credit card, didn't you?" I asked. Daniel didn't answer. He just stared at his empty plate. "Kylie, honey," Mom began, her fingers fluttering like a trapped bird. We didn't know. You should have told us you were so successful. Things would have been different." "That's the problem, Mom." I set the bottle down with a firm thud. "It shouldn't have mattered if I was successful. I shouldn't have had to own the roof over your head for you to treat me like a human being at my own Christmas dinner." I turned to Daniel. "You told me I needed to find a new place by January 1st. I think that's a great idea, but it's not the one moving." "You can't kick me out," Daniel hissed, though the venom was gone, replaced by desperation. "I'm your brother." "And I'm your landlord," I replied. "And as of right now, I'm initiating a formal audit of the Hartwell Legacy Trust you tried to set up. If I find 1 cent of Mom and Dad's retirement in your personal accounts, I won't just evict you, I'll call the Bar Association." Mom let out a choked sob, burying her face in her hands. The heirloom china and the grandmother's silver seemed to mock her now. The hunter green wallpaper felt like a cage. I looked at the 847th fleur-de-lis and realized I didn't need to count them anymore.
The silence that followed was heavy, smelling of cold gravy and the bitter scent of scorched bridges. I stood at the head of the table, the seat my father usually occupied, and looked down at the ruins of our perfect Christmas. You're serious?" Mom whispered, her hands finally dropping from her face. Her mascara had smudged, dark streaks cutting through her carefully applied foundation. For the first time in my life, she looked her age. "You would actually throw your brother out into the snow?" "He was ready to throw me out, Mom. He was ready to let you and Dad lose everything just so he could keep up appearances," I reminded her. I felt a strange sense of detachment, like I was watching a movie of my own life. The difference is I'm giving him a choice. He leaves quietly or I open the books. He's a lawyer. He knows how to calculate the risks. Daniel looked up, his eyes bloodshot. The arrogance had leaked out of him, leaving behind a hollow shell of a man. "Kylie, please, if the firm finds out about the escrow, if they even hear a whisper of an audit, I'm finished." "You finished yourself, Daniel, the moment you decided your sister was a burden because she wouldn't play your game." I turned my gaze to my mother. "And you, Mom? You spent years counting Daniel's successes like they were your own, while you treated my life like a tragedy you had to endure. You wanted a partner in the family? Well, you have a CEO instead.
How does that sit with the Hartwell legacy? Evelyn flinched. She looked around the room, at the silver candlesticks she'd polished for hours, the expensive wine Daniel had stolen to impress her, the wallpaper I'd spent my childhood counting. It was all a stage set, and the curtains had just been ripped down. I just wanted us to be respectable, she stammered, her voice thin. I wanted people to look at us and see success. You wanted then to see a reflection, I said, my voice softening but remaining firm. But you were looking in the wrong direction. You were so busy admiring the gold leaf on the frame that you didn't notice the canvas was rotting. Dad stood up then. He walked over to the window, pulling back the heavy velvet curtain to look out at the snow piling up on the driveway. The snow is getting deep, he said quietly. Kylie's right, Evelyn. We've been living a lie, a very expensive, very cruel lie. He turned back to the table, looking at me with a clarity I hadn't seen in years. What happens now, Kylie? You own the walls, you own the floor. What happens to us? I took a deep breath, the cold air from the hallway chilling the room. I'm not a monster, Dad. I'm not going to put you on the street, but the Hartwell way of doing things is over. There will be no more investments for Daniel. There will be no more pretending we can afford a life paid for by debt and deception. I looked at my mother, who was staring at me as if she were seeing me for the very first time. The dumb blonde daughter was Dawn. In her place was the woman who held the keys to her world. Mom, you can stay, but the guest room, that's my office now. And Daniel, he has until tomorrow morning to pack his bags. If his car is still in my driveway by noon, I'm calling the tow truck and the bank. Daniel let out a choked sound, a mix of a sob and a laugh. He knew he'd lost. He stood up, his movements jerky and uncoordinated, and stumbled out of the room without looking back. A moment later, we heard the heavy thud of his bedroom door upstairs. I looked at my parents. The turkey was cold. The fire was dead. I'm going to my room. I suggest you both do the same. We have a lot of paperwork to go over in the morning. As I walked out of the dining room, I paused at the door. I looked at the hunter green wallpaper one last time. 847. Tomorrow, I was going to hire a crew to tear it all down.
Upstairs, in the room that was supposed to be a temporary stopover, I sat on the edge of the bed. I didn't turn on the lights. The only illumination came from the moonlight reflecting off the snow outside, casting long, blue shadows across the floorboards. I reached up and pulled the elastic band from my hair, letting my blonde locks fall over my shoulders. I caught my reflection in the vanity mirror, a pale, sharp-eyed ghost of the girl who used to hide in this very room to escape her mother's voice. I didn't look like a burden. I looked like someone who had survived a war and won the territory. A soft knock brushed against the wood of my door, not the frantic, demanding pound of my mother or the arrogant rap of Daniel. It was hesitant. "Come in, Dad," I said. The door creaked open. My father stood there, silhouetted by the hallway light. He wasn't wearing his festive cardigan anymore. He was in a worn flannel robe, looking smaller than he had at dinner. He was carrying 2 mugs of tea, the steam rising in thin, ghostly ribbons. "I thought you might be awake," he said, stepping inside. He handed me a mug. It was Earl Grey, heavy on the honey, the way he used to make it for me when I had the flu as a kid. "Thanks." I took a sip, the warmth spreading through my chest, chasing away some of the icy adrenaline from the dining room. He sat in the old wooden rocking chair in the corner, the one that groaned with every movement. For a long time, we just sat in the dark, listening to the wind whistle through the eaves of the house I now owned. "I knew," he said, finally, his voice thick. "Not about K-Star, not about you being, well, a mogul, but I knew Daniel was drowning. I saw the letters from the bank. I saw the way he looked at the mail before your mother could get to it." "Why didn't you say anything?" I asked. I wasn't angry, just tired.
Because your mother needed him to be the hero, Dad whispered. And I was too tired to be the villain who told her the truth. I let him play his games because it kept the peace. I didn't realize the price of that peace was your dignity. He looked at me, his eyes shiny in the dark. You've been carrying us for 3 years, Kylie, while we sat at that table and let her say those things to you. I am so sorry. I didn't do it for the apology, Dad, I said, looking down into my tea. I did it because this house is the only thing you have left. If I'd let Daniel have his way, you'd be living in a 2-bedroom condo while he gambled away the rest of the equity. I know. He stood up, his knees popping. He walked over and pressed a hand to my shoulder. His palm was calloused and warm. He's packing. I heard the suitcases clicking shut. I don't think he'll wait until noon. Good, I said. And your mother? She's in shock, I replied. She's realized that the person she spent 10 years looking down on is the only person she has to look up to now. It's a hard pill to swallow. Dad nodded slowly. Get some sleep, Kylie. Tomorrow is the first day this house hasn't been under a cloud in a long time. He left, closing the door softly. I walked over to the window. Down below, I saw the headlights of Daniel's BMW cut through the falling snow. The engine turned over, a low growl in the quiet night. He didn't wait for the morning. He didn't even say goodbye. I watched the red glow of his taillights disappear down the driveway, leaving nothing but deep ruts in the fresh white powder. The golden boy was gone. I lay back on the pillows, smelling the faint scent of old lavender and cedar. For the first time in 847 days, I didn't feel the need to count anything. I just closed my eyes and listened to the silence of my own home. The morning sun was blindingly bright, reflecting off the fresh Connecticut snow and pouring through the windows of the breakfast nook. I'd slept better than I had in years. I woke up, pulled my blonde hair back into a sleek, efficient knot, and headed downstairs. The house was unnervingly quiet. No sounds of Daniel's booming voice on the phone, no clatter of heirloom china, just the hum of the refrigerator. I found my mother in the kitchen. She was standing by the island, staring at a half-empty box of Christmas cookies. She was wearing a silk robe, but she hadn't done her hair or makeup yet. To anyone else, she looked like a woman enjoying a slow morning. To me, she looked like a woman who had just realized she was a guest in her own life. "Good morning," I said, walking past her to pour myself a cup of coffee. She jumped slightly. "Kylie, good morning. I was going to make omelets. Daniel loves—" She stopped herself, her voice trailing off. She looked at the empty seat where Daniel usually sat, demanding his coffee. "Daniel left last night, Mom," I reminded her gently. "I know. I heard the car. I didn't go down. I didn't know what to say." I sat at the table, not the big mahogany one in the dining room, but the small marble one in the nook. There isn't much to say. He made his choices. Now we have to make ours. I pulled my laptop from my bag and opened it. The screen glowed with spreadsheets, real numbers, not the inflated fantasies Daniel had been feeding them. "I've already been in touch with my legal team," I said, my fingers flying over the keys. "We're starting a deep dive into the legacy trust Daniel tried to set up. If he moved any of your liquid assets into his personal accounts, we'll find them. I'll make sure you and Dad have enough for a comfortable retirement, but the days of funding Daniel's partnerships are over." Mom sat down across from me. She looked at my laptop, then at my face. She seemed to be searching for the daughter who used to count the fleur-de-lis, the one who took the insults with a bowed head. She couldn't find her. "Kylie," she began, her voice trembling. "How did you do it? How did you become this, right under our noses?" "By being a burden, Mom," I said, looking her in the eye. "While you were focusing on Daniel's image, you stopped looking at me altogether. It's amazing what you can build when people think you're invisible." A loud knock at the front door interrupted us. "Who is that?" Mom asked, her old social reflexes kicking in. "It's too early for guests." "It's not a guest," I said, standing up. I walked to the door and opened it. Two men in work jumpsuits stood on the porch, carrying rolls of neutral-toned drop cloths and a variety of scraping tools. Behind them, a woman with a clipboard and a designer tape measure waited. "Good morning, Miss Hartwell. I'm Sarah from Miller Design. You called about the wallpaper?" "Right on time," I said, stepping back to let them in. I led them into the dining room. The smell of yesterday's turkey still lingered in the air, but the room felt colder now. I pointed to the hunter green walls, the 847 gold symbols mocking me from every corner. "Tear it down," I said. "All of it. I want the walls sanded and primed by this afternoon. We're going with something bright, something clean." Mom stood in the doorway, her hand over her mouth as the workers began to spread the cloths over the mahogany table. She watched as one of the men took a scraper to the first fleur-de-lis, stripping away a jagged piece of the green paper to reveal the plain gray plaster underneath. "But that's grandmother's wallpaper." "No, Mom," I said, turning to her. "It's my wall, and I'm tired of counting." By New Year's Eve, the house sounded different. The heavy, suffocating silence of the Hartwell legacy had been replaced by the rhythmic shrit-shritch of sandpaper and the upbeat hum of a radio playing in the hallway. The hunter green wallpaper was gone. In its place was a soft, gallery white that made the room feel 3 times larger, as if the walls themselves had finally taken a deep breath. I stood in the center of the dining room, my blonde hair tied up in a messy bun, wearing a pair of old jeans and a sweatshirt. I wasn't the financial burden or the invisible consultant today. I was the owner. Mom walked into the room, carrying a tray of coffee. She moved differently now, slower, more cautious. She didn't march in to inspect for dust. She hovered at the edge of the drop cloths, looking at the white walls with a bewildered expression. "It's so bright," she said, setting the tray on a folding work table. "It's clean, Mom," I replied, taking a mug. "It's a fresh start." She looked at me, really looked at me, without the lens of Daniel's success or my failure. "Kylie, I've been talking to your father. We've decided to move into the carriage house on the back of the property, if that's still okay with you." I paused, the warm ceramic of the mug heating my palms. The carriage house was small but beautiful, recently renovated with my own money. "You don't have to do that. There's plenty of room here." "No," she said, and for the first time I heard a note of genuine humility in her voice. "This is your house. You bought it. You saved it. It's time you lived in it without us looming over you. Besides, your father wants to turn the second bedroom there into a workshop. He's always wanted to get back into woodworking." I felt a lump form in my throat. For 30 years, I'd wanted her approval. Now that I didn't need it anymore, she was finally giving it. "I'd like that," I said quietly. "And Daniel?" Her face tightened for a second, then softened. "She called. He's staying with a friend in the city. He asked for money, of course. I told him he should talk to his investment group about it. Then I hung up." I couldn't help it. I laughed, a real, genuine laugh that echoed off the bare, white walls. Mom offered a small, tentative smile in return. It wasn't a perfect reconciliation. Years of resentment don't vanish in a week. But the power dynamic had permanently shifted. The golden child was a memory, and the burden was the anchor. As the sun began to set on the final day of the year, I walked through the house alone. I stopped in the dining room and ran my hand along the smooth, primed plaster where the 847th fleur-de-lis used to be. I realized then that I wasn't just fixing a house, I was reclaiming a life. I had spent years waiting for them to see my value, only to realize that my value was what allowed me to walk away from their judgment in the first place. I walked to the front door and opened it, letting the crisp, freezing New Year's Eve air fill the hallway. The snow was untouched, a vast white canvas stretching out toward the gates. I was 31 years old, I was a millionaire, I was a daughter, and finally, in the house that had once felt like a prison, I was home. I stepped out onto the porch, the cold wind biting at my cheeks, and looked up at the winter stars. The counting was over. The living was just beginning.